Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 News. Max Verstappen has confirmed for one of the first times publicly that he is absolutely considering a potential future away from Red Bull, while his current focus remains on trying to win this year's World Drivers' Championship with Red Bull Racing. That does not guarantee in the long term that's where he's going to stay, especially with Helmut Marko confirming there are performance contract clauses in place that if Red Bull don't deliver the car, Max is able to walk away. Very much interested in your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always, I greatly appreciate it. We have some liveries to discuss for the US Grand Prix, but just quickly on Valtteri Bottas, we still don't know all the pieces of the driver market right now. This is arguably the big piece remaining. The Red Bull story is going to carry some weight because we're not going to know who's getting that second drive at RB, or potentially who may or may not replace Perez at Red Bull for quite some time to come. Whereas I'd have maybe expected by now, especially given that we've had a big break after Singapore going into Austin, Sauber to have made up their mind. Apparently they haven't. Bottas was the favourite, arguably still is the favourite, but Colapinto, Bortoleto, the potential of even Mick Schumacher is now back on the table. When we heard Mattia Binotto talk about that the other day, there are other options out there that are fighting for the spot with Valtteri Bottas as it stands. These are some of the special liveries though. Haas have a major upgrade package in the works this weekend. Last year, let's not forget, they brought an upgrade to Austin that really failed quite spectacularly. It certainly didn't deliver the performance gains in terms of tyre deg they were looking for at last year's race. You guys remember last year's Haas was woeful on its tyres. They brought an upgrade, it didn't really work, and then after that race going into like Mexico and beyond, Hülkenberg and Magnussen kind of like split their specifications and Haas looked to be an absolute shambles. It's been a long 12 months for Haas and a very impactful 12 months for Haas in a positive direction. This weekend they bring an upgrade that if it works, I mean wow, what a team turnaround they have had and may well continue to have, especially because it was confirmed today that Toyota will allow Haas to build their first ever simulator. Now, Toyota have used facilities at Dallara, they've used Ferrari's simulator before in their, wind tunnel and stuff like this. But look, this is going to be the first time they're going to have their own simulator effectively, and Toyota with that new partnership are helping to make that happen. So it's a big deal for not just Toyota getting back into the sport in some capacity, but certainly also for Haas. And if they've made this amount of progress as they have, as the entity that Haas have been, what could they potentially go on to achieve in the future, right? Because the fact of the matter is, many of these Formula 1 teams are mismanaged. I mean, we know what Alpine have done over the last few years. So, maybe Gene Haas was right all along to say, look, yes, my organisation is small, but if we simply manage things properly, we can at least be a reasonably competitive force. Of course, Komatsu has to tell Gene, like, look, we're not going to be winning championships on this level of investment because look what Lawrence Stroll is doing at Aston Martin and, of course, competing with the big teams Red Bull, Mercedes, Ferrari. That's a major challenge in and of itself anyway. But, Haas are doing arguably as best they can with what they currently have, and they've got an upgrade in the works this weekend. They intend to deliver them the ability to score a fair few more points. Speaking of McLaren, again, they do have another livery for the upcoming weekends. Another chrome livery is returning to the car. This looks rather good. Of course, they ran the kind of old school McLaren MP4 style design a few weeks ago, and now they've got this chrome version effectively, which also looks pretty good, I'm not going to lie. So this is what McLaren are rocking with for the upcoming weekends. We know that McLaren, they love a sponsorship. They love a special arrangement. Of course, this is, Google related, Google Chrome related, of course, also harkening back, if you will, to the old McLaren days, the Vodafone cars with the Chrome. It's, good times thinking back to then. But look, they've got a championship to win. They've got a couple of championships to win. We think the constructors is probably no problem at all. The drivers, that is, of course, the big question right now. But yeah, McLaren are cooking up something for the weekends. So are Alpine. They have a special livery too for, I'm guessing there's a new Indiana Jones film, and this is the livery for the car. Now, I'm kind of not sure what colour it actually is, just because the lighting here is clearly like that, Indiana Jones orange. So, is it actually orange? Is it going to look somewhat different to this? Are we not just like Papaya Rules 2.0 here with this new Alpine livery? But yeah, it's an interesting one for sure. It's kind of cool. I get it, right? The way that it's been designed, it looks like an artifact. I kind of see the vision. But it effectively looks like Renault and Alpine here have come up with a McLaren livery for the upcoming weekends. We'll see how good, of course, it looks on the track. Now, let's talk RB. Of course, in the AlphaTauri brand and livery last year, where Lawson was driving the car pretty much this time last season, Horner apparently told Lawson he would have a race seat at some point this year, which is interesting that Lawson's revealing quite a lot on us here what happens. Lawson also confirms that he'd found out 2 weeks before Ricciardo was gone that he was going to be getting Ricciardo's drive, despite the fact that Ricciardo seemingly didn't seem to know, nor did the media until rather later. So Lawson then says that, yeah, Horner confirms that he would get a drive this year, which means one of two things, because I don't think Yuki was ever going anywhere, because Red Bull seemed content with him as, supporting Honda or whatever in that second team. They don't seem to see him as a realistic option to replace anyone at Red Bull, although Helmut Marko probably does. Christian Horner doesn't seem to. So I'm not necessarily sure Yuki was going to go anywhere, which raises the question really, okay, if Lawson was always getting a race seat, there was only two possibilities, and he was realistically never going to go straight into the Red Bull, right? So it was seemingly decided before the season that either Ricciardo would outperform Perez, or let's say outperform Tsunoda, and therefore earn a spot over Perez. Perez would go, Ricciardo would come into Red Bull, and Lawson would take the vacant seat at RB. Or if Ricciardo didn't perform, or at least outperform Tsunoda, then Ricciardo would go, Perez would stay, and Lawson would come in instead. So it seems like the decision for either Perez, this is at least my read, for either Perez or Ricciardo to go mid-season was made before this year even began. So it seems like Red Bull knew that Lawson was going to get a drive, and it was going to be it was going to be for Ricciardo either way. The question was whether Ricciardo was going to go to Red Bull or whether he was going to get kicked out of the organisation entirely. So it just, feels even worse for Ricciardo on some level, right? That he was not aware of this possibility, it seems, until very recently, that he's now officially off the grid, despite the fact that Lawson could probably have put 2 and 2 together that Ricciardo was not going to finish the year at RB before the season even began, despite the fact that no one knew that until recently. So it is, again, controversial, but it is Red Bull at the end of the day. This is what they do. And Lawson does give his perspective on what he's expected to perform at, what he's expected to achieve, because he's coming in this weekend with a grid penalty as well for a new engine, which is pretty tough. Obviously, that's going to affect the race. And he's not driven the F1 car for quite some time. So he's going to be alongside Yuki Tsunoda, of course. His expectations, as far as he is concerned, is to do just as well as Yuki, at least at the start. I think that is the expectation for Red Bull and for RB. If Lawson comes in, matches Tsunoda for the first couple of rounds, then outperforms him in the last couple of rounds, that arguably is enough to either keep his drive for next year or, of course, potentially get promoted to Red Bull, which is the point. So, but Lawson also says they want points, which is only possible if the car is good enough to do so. But at the end of the day, that will be critical if Lawson can score points if Yuki were not to, for example. But Horner does confirm. It's always interesting when Horner confirms these things. I don't think there's anything really in it, because technically Lawson is a Red Bull driver that they're loaning to VCarb, is technically how the operation goes. But it's always a little bit strange, isn't it? I'm sure Zach Brown has his thoughts on this when this type of activity is not announced publicly by their own team principal, but rather a team principal of another team. Like, it's not Laurent Marquis saying this, team principal of RB, it's Christian Horner, team principal of Red Bull, saying, yeah, Lawson's going to get a 10-place engine-related grid penalty. I'm pretty sure that's what it's going to be for the upcoming round. Now, to be fair, this is known, so given Horner was asked the question, he's not going to just deny it for no good reason, when it's kind of been known publicly that this is going to be happening to Lawson, unfortunately for him. But we've got a few other pieces to dive into as well. Another rookie, of course, on the grid next year is going to be Kimi Antonelli. I'm just seeing some interesting quotes from Antonelli over the last few days, and this was another one I just thought I'd mention real quick, because he was discussing how Russell wasn't so happy when he crashed his car back in Monza, but also after that happening, he said, I didn't expect that, as in Hamilton kind of resigning from Mercedes and going elsewhere. He's very nice and he talks to me a lot, and looking at the data, his driving style seems similar to mine. I was in Singapore and listening him talk talk to the engineers. I learned a lot, he says. So, that's very interesting. Antonelli being a sponge to try and learn as much as he can about Lewis Hamilton and the way that he interacts with the team. But even just this piece, right, his driving style seems similar to mine. So, Antonelli, we saw a quote yesterday where he says, yeah, speed, pace, no problem for me this season. It's the other questions that are there. And Antonelli's now saying, yeah, well, Hamilton, what a guy, what a driver, what a champion, great as ever, whatever. But also pretty similar driving style to mine. So, I like the confidence of this kid, right? It doesn't seem like anything about Antonelli's performance at Monza and the FP1 crash has really docked his confidence at all. We'll see what happens when he actually gets to the track this upcoming season. But it's exciting, right? Whether it works, whether it doesn't work, whether it's too early, whether Mercedes have made a mistake, like whatever your perspective on that potentially is, the reality is that Antonelli is an exciting prospect for the grid, whether he puts it in the wall or whether he starts winning races in his rookie season. Speaking of Hamilton, though, there was a couple of interesting pieces at Ferrari. For example, Vasseur saying that Hamilton is not here for a holiday, right? Like, this guy is here to win. Leclerc, of course, admitting that it's going to be a challenge alongside Hamilton for the new season, but probably in a positive sense. Leclerc also confident that Ferrari can fight for next year's championship, potentially both of them, of course. As I say relatively often here, it has been a very long time, 2008 since Ferrari won the Constructors, 2007 with Kimi Räikkönen since they won the Drivers. Whether they are finally back in a position to potentially challenge, it seems like they are close. But unfortunately for Ferrari, that stints they had in the middle of the season around like Canada and Austria and Silverstone, those races was so bad after their upgrades failed that it pretty much put Leclerc out of any chance of fighting for this year's World Championship. But like next year they might be better. Of course, they look on a decent trajectory right now going into next season, especially if their upgrades they brought in Monza start working on more traditional circuits such as Austin. I think it's going to be a big test actually for Ferrari this upcoming weekend, especially because I think they have one upgrade due now and then one upgrade due in like a week or two's time. So there's a couple more upgrades in the works for Ferrari, then they will be done until 2025, of course. Sainz was also kind of asked the question, hey, Matteo Binotto the other day said he wouldn't have replaced you, he'd have kept you and not signed Lewis Hamilton. Sainz like, that's kind of interesting. Sainz does also say, though, he wants to win one more time with Ferrari before he departs the team and goes over to Williams. And then he was asked a question on Hamilton, he says, look, I just want to keep my opinion to myself. So you could, of course, speculate what that means. He didn't want to say anything on the Hamilton piece. Like, I'm sure on some level Sainz gets it, why Hamilton is coming in from Fred Vasseur's perspective and from the team's perspective. Of course, he's not going to be happy about it. I'm sure in Sainz's own head he's thinking, look, I'm just as good, if not better than Hamilton. He's past it, whatever. Maybe that's his opinion, maybe it's not, I don't know. But whatever it is, he decides to keep it to himself, maybe because if he says something publicly, that would cause further uproar. But let's talk about some of this Red Bull drama, right? Because they are bringing upgrades this weekend. It's an important weekend for every single team, especially Red Bull and Max Verstappen. If Red Bull's upgrades work this weekend, if McLaren's either don't or they don't quite deliver the performance that they're looking for in terms of their new upgrades they're bringing to the car, then we could have a very different story in our hand in terms of the way the championship has gone over the last few rounds. But it's a major upgrade packages in the works for Mercedes, for Red Bull, certainly for McLaren as well, if the time potentially comes there. Mercedes have a new floor on the way and a final update package of the season set to debut this weekend. And it's a big one for Mercedes as well, right? Because Ferrari's upgrades, they need to work. They need to take them in a step in the right direction. It's true for Mercedes also because otherwise, who is going to challenge McLaren for the championships next season? It's going to be a challenge. It's probably going to be Max, wherever he is, especially if Red Bull turn it around as well. So these are Max's performances so far this season. The last time we had a sprint was back in Austria, right? When Max won the sprint, could have won the race, then he clashed with Lando, finishes 5th in the ends. But since then, we've had 7 races with no sprints, of course, and every sprint so far, Max has won. He won in China, he won the sprint in, of course, Miami as well, but then was 2nd in the race behind Lando Norris, his first ever win, won the sprint as well. So every single sprint so far this season, Max has won, and there are 3 more to go. But if he stops winning the sprint races, and of course Lando Norris has been so good in qualifying this season that, he's picked up, 5 pole positions over the last several rounds in the time span that Oscar Piastri has had 0 pole positions, despite still doing very well in the Grand Prix. That is something that Lando can use to his advantage with 2 qualifying sessions now on a weekend, where it definitely seems like McLaren remain with the fastest car, but Max's championship lead, 52 points, is still pretty nice. But if it starts to disappear, Red Bull know they don't necessarily have a guarantee on Verstappen. Now, he's going to be there next season. He had the opportunity to go to Mercedes. There were rumours, still are rumours. The Jos Verstappen has had like a verbal agreement with Toto Wolff to say, look, Max is going to go to Mercedes if the time comes. And Helmut Marko admits, like, Red Bull cannot guarantee anything with regard to Max's future right now, given the way things are written behind the scenes. And this is what Max says. He knows that it's possible that he departs the team. Now, look, he says he's not thinking about that right now. He's focused on the present, and understandably so. He's trying to hold on to this year's championship, working with Red Bull to make that happen. He wants to do better. But look, Max has made it relatively clear that it's not been a great performance from his own team over the last several months, and there's lots of room, you could argue, for improvement within that Red Bull organisation. That's what Max is going to be looking to try and achieve, and we'll see if they can actually make that happen, right? Because as he says in a couple of interesting quotes here, look, it's definitely possible that he goes somewhere else for 2026. He was asked the question if he enjoys the fact that he appears to have options, with several teams keeping their options open for Max. We know Mercedes, we know that Aston Martin are probably the two front runners there, and he says, yeah, it's possible. It's not something I'm thinking about, but he admits that, like, look, he's not necessarily locked in to stay with Red Bull until the end of his contract in 2028. He says it's possible that he goes elsewhere depending on the circumstances, and look, sure, he wants to focus on the present, but it's far from a guarantee, and, Red Bull even themselves say it. I mean, Helmut Marko mentioned this just, the other day or so, that most big drivers have exit clauses in their contract that are performance related, and so does Max, and Marko making it quite clear what the Red Bull contract status is. If we cannot give him a car to fight at the front, then it will definitely be something he will think about. So Marko even admits, yeah, Max could leave if we don't give him the car. And Max himself is like, well, yeah, like, it's possible that I leave if I don't have the car. So the next season he's going to be there. But in 2026, given that we think maybe the Mercedes engine is going to be the strongest, or maybe Honda continue to do a great job, and of course, Max's success in Formula 1 has come with Honda engines and with Adrian Newey designed cars. Both of those things are available on Lawrence Stroll's Aston Martin organisation, of course, and Mercedes have quite a lot to offer potentially as well. So, look, Max is obviously going to focus down and knuckle down with Red Bull until the end of the season, but it's quite clear that Max is aware of the possibilities that are available to him on the open market, and the fact that, like, basically every team, with maybe one or two exceptions, would be very keen to get Max into their organisation if he was willing to. But of course, that's the other point as well. Is he still enjoying things? And I know that was raised as a possibility too, as like if Max isn't enjoying the sport, if he doesn't enjoy the 24 rounds with 6 sprints, maybe more sprints going into the future as well, the FIA getting on his nerves with regard to the swearing or whatever the case might be, maybe Max just says, you know what, I've had enough of this. I'm not even going to go and join another team going forward. And even Marko said that the other day, that, like, he's not like Verstappen, this is a Hamilton and Alonso, when he will just go as long as he can go while he's still competitive. Max wants to do other things, and apparently he will if the time comes, if there's no better opportunity. So very much interested to your thoughts, as ever, on all this stuff in the comment section. But of course, this was the scene on 2 occasions, the US Grand Prix in Austin, of Lewis Hamilton winning the World Drivers' Championship. But of course, not going to be the case for any driver this year, because it is not possible for Max to lock it in quite yet, of course. But very much interested to your thoughts, as ever, in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, take care, and I'll see you next time.